Imagine this scene. In a small provincial town in northern Roman Palestine, in a town called Nazareth, lives a carpenter's son. A man who received no systematic book education, did not belong to the priestly class, never held any official position. This man begins to preach, and within a few years gathers thousands of listeners. He is executed as a troublemaker in the prime of his life. And 2 millennia after his death, his name is spoken by over 2 billion people across the globe. Christianity became the largest religion in human history, and at its foundation lies the figure of a first-century Jewish teacher from Galilee. Here is the first enigma of this story, but there is a second, no less astonishing one. The very people from whom this teacher came, the people whose sacred scripture he interpreted, whose prophets, in the view of his followers, predicted his coming, this people, for the most part, never recognized him as the Messiah. Not then, in the first century, and not now, 2 millennia later. The Jewish people to this day await the Messiah and believe he has not yet come. How is this possible? How did the same person, the same texts, the same history lead to 2 completely different religious traditions, Christianity and Judaism, which look at each other across a chasm of 2 millennia of mutual misunderstanding and often hostility? Why was the rupture that occurred in the first century in a small province of a vast empire so deep and so long-lasting? This investigation is dedicated to one of the most complex questions in religious history. We will try to understand what Jewish expectations of the Messiah were in the first century, what exactly Jesus offered, and why this offer was rejected by the majority of his compatriots. We will examine the theological disagreements that over time turned into a chasm, and the history of the relationship between the 2 traditions, which proved far more tragic than one might have assumed at the outset. This is not about who is right, but about how it happened. This is a story of people, texts, and an era. Let's start with the context, because without understanding the world in which Jesus lived and what his contemporaries expected, all subsequent history remains incomprehensible. 1st century BCE and 1st century CE Palestine is a land under Roman rule. Formally, the Jews retained the right to practice their religion. The Jerusalem temple stood, sacrifices were offered, synagogues functioned. But over all this hung the heavy shadow of occupation. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets. Roman officials collected taxes. Roman procurators decided who would live and who would die. And the Jews, who preserved the memory of times when their people were independent, when David and Solomon ruled a great kingdom, felt like strangers in their own land. Pressure was felt at every level of life. A peasant in Galilee paid taxes to the Romans, taxes to the Herodian dynasty, and contributions to the temple. What remained was barely enough for sustenance. In the cities, Jerusalem, Tiberias, Caesarea, trade was bustling, but this trade primarily enriched those who collaborated with the occupiers. Tax collectors, the local aristocracy, the priestly elite. These were all people who knew how to live with Rome and were therefore perceived by the common people as traitors. Under these conditions, the idea of the Messiah acquired particular urgency. The word Mashiach in Hebrew means anointed one, the person anointed for kingship or priestly service. In the Torah, kings and high priests were called this. But over time, especially after the Babylonian exile, then after the Greek conquest, then under the Roman yoke, this word began to fill with another meaning. The anointed one, the one whom God would send to liberate the people. the one who would restore the kingdom of David, the one through whom what Israel had awaited for centuries would be accomplished. There was no single opinion among first-century Jews about exactly what this coming and this kingdom should be like. And this is important to understand. Judaism of that time was not a monolith. It was a living, disputing, internally diverse tradition. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, Scribes, each of these movements read the prophets in its own way and imagined the Messiah in its own way. The Pharisees, the most influential popular movement of that era, emphasized strict observance of the law, the Torah, and developed an extensive system of oral interpretations. For them, the Messiah was primarily a righteous man who would achieve the fulfillment of God's will on earth. The Sadducees, an aristocratic priestly class closely connected with the Jerusalem temple, were generally skeptical of apocalyptic expectations. For them, stability and religious order were valued above messianic dreams. The Essenes, an ascetic community living in the desert by the Dead Sea, awaited two messiahs, a priestly one and a royal one. The Zealots were convinced that liberation had to be won by force and did not await heavenly intervention. They were preparing an armed uprising. But despite all this diversity, several traits can be identified that most Jews of that time expected from the coming Messiah. First, he was to be a man, mortal, of flesh and blood, a descendant of King David, a son of David, as the prophets said. Second, he was to be a great political and military leader, capable of liberating Israel from foreign yoke. Third, he was to restore Jerusalem as the capital of an independent kingdom and rebuild or cleanse the temple. Fourth, he was to gather the scattered Jews from all corners of the earth. Finally, his coming was to be marked by the onset of universal peace. In other words, they awaited a victor. These expectations were fueled by specific texts. The prophet Isaiah spoke of a shoot from the stump of Jesse, David's father, who would judge the nations and establish a kingdom of justice. The prophet Jeremiah promised a righteous branch from David's line, who would reign wisely. The prophet Micah pointed to Bethlehem as the birthplace of the future ruler of Israel. Zechariah painted a picture where Jerusalem becomes the center of the world and all nations come to worship the God of Israel. Daniel described a coming kingdom that would crush all earthly kingdoms. All these texts were read and interpreted precisely as the expectation of an earthly liberator. In the first century, this expectation was at its peak. According to the testimonies of historians of that era, primarily the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in Greek in the last third of the first century, Palestine teemed with preachers, prophets, and men whom their followers considered the Messiah, or at least his forerunner. John the Baptist, executed by the Tetrarch Herod Antipas, gathered thousands of people on the banks of the Jordan for ritual washing, a symbol of purification and preparation for something great. A Samaritan, whose name history has not preserved, led people to Mount Gerizim with a promise to reveal sacred vessels supposedly hidden there by Moses, and was dispersed and executed by Pilate. Various false prophets, as Josephus called them, raised popular movements which Rome invariably suppressed brutally and quickly. Messianic fever was not an exception, but the norm of that era. Into this atmosphere entered Jesus of Nazareth. What we can know about the historical Jesus relies on several sources. First of all, the four Gospels, written approximately between the 60th and 90th years of our era. They are not strictly biographical documents in the modern sense. These are texts written by believers for believing communities with a theological purpose. But behind their theological layer, historians try to discern historical features. The Gospel of Mark is considered the earliest in origin, concise, swift, almost without theological discussions. The later Gospel of John is saturated with theological reflection and strikingly different in style and emphasis. Besides the Gospels, there are brief mentions by the same Josephus and by the Roman historian Tacitus, which is important in itself. Non-Jewish, non-Christian sources record the existence of Christ, executed under Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. This confirms that we are dealing with a real historical figure, not a mythical character. What do historians generally consider reliably established? Jesus was a Jew, born in Galilee at the end of the 1st century BCE, or the very beginning of our era. He spoke Aramaic, the spoken language of Jewish Palestine at that time. He underwent the baptism ritual by John the Baptist, and apparently was his disciple for some time. He preached in Galilee and Judea, primarily in synagogues and open spaces, addressing a wide variety of people: fishermen, peasants, tax officials, women. He gathered disciples. He was known as a healer, a man possessing spiritual power, which even his opponents did not deny but explained differently. And around the year 30 of our era, he was arrested, condemned, and crucified by order of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. The essence of his preaching, as reconstructed from the Gospels, consisted of proclaiming the kingdom of God, Malkut Shemayim in Aramaic, the kingdom of heaven. His Jewish listeners immediately recognized this concept. It was in the air of that era. But how he depicted this kingdom diverged from familiar expectations. Not conquest, but transformation. Not victory over an external enemy, but internal change. Not political domination, but the triumph of justice and love. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. This is not a slogan of a revolutionary movement. Love your enemies. This is not a call to resist Rome. When you are struck on one cheek, turn the other. This fundamentally contradicts the logic of armed liberation. Listeners expecting a call to rebellion heard something completely different instead. For people who awaited an armed liberator, this was unexpected. For some, inspiring. For others, disappointing. For others, suspicious. And for his disciples, puzzling. They walked with him, saw his miracles, and still until the very end did not understand how this story would end. The Gospels preserve these moments of misunderstanding with remarkable honesty. Among those who viewed Jesus' activity with growing anxiety were the religious leaders of Jerusalem. The picture painted by the Gospels depicts a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, and between Jesus and the priestly class, the Sadducees. Historians remind us, this picture is written from one point of view and likely contains simplifications. Later rabbinic sources portray the Pharisees as far more complex and worthy people than they are presented in the Gospels. But the fact of the conflict is not in doubt, and the reasons for this conflict are clear. The Pharisees were the guardians of oral tradition, an extensive system of Torah interpretations that over centuries had grown into a detailed code of conduct. Their goal was to protect Jewish identity under conditions where foreign cultures pressed from all sides. Jesus publicly ignored some of their rules. He healed on the Sabbath, a day of complete rest when any work was forbidden, and defended his right to do so. He ate with people considered unclean, tax collectors, lepers, prostitutes. He declared sins forgiven, and the right to forgive sins, from the point of view of Jewish theology, belonged to God. The Sadducees, the aristocratic priestly class controlling the Jerusalem temple, had other concerns. The temple was not only a religious, but also a political and economic center. It was there that donations flowed, there that festive sacrifices were made, from there that the high priest's authority emanated. When Jesus came to Jerusalem during Passover and, according to the gospel account, overturned the tables of the merchants in the temple courtyard and drove out the money changers, this was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a public demonstration witnessed by thousands of pilgrims. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the temple. The political context was key. Rome did not tolerate unrest in the provinces. Any person gathering crowds, proclaiming a kingdom, and entering Jerusalem to the welcoming cries of the people. And this, according to the Gospels, is exactly how Jesus' entry on a donkey into the festive, overcrowded city looked, was automatically a potential troublemaker from the perspective of both the Roman authorities and the local elites who valued their position and peace. Josephus describes how quickly and harshly Rome reacted to any popular movement in Judea. Arrest, trial, execution, all this happened within a few days. Jesus was crucified, that is, executed in the Roman manner, applied to rebels and slaves. It was an intentionally humiliating and agonizingly long public execution designed to intimidate. For his disciples, it was a collapse. The Messiah could not be defeated and executed. This contradicted the very meaning of the word Messiah. A crucified Messiah was, from the point of view of Jewish theology of that time, an internal contradiction. The Messiah was supposed to win. This one was executed. And here the story takes a turn that changed everything. A few days after the execution, Jesus' disciples claimed that he had risen from the dead. They saw him, spoke with him, ate with him after death. This claim is not historical in the usual sense. It can neither be proven nor disproven by the methods of historical science. The resurrection, if it occurred, lies beyond what history as a science can investigate. But historically, something else is certain. This belief became the engine of one of the fastest religious movements in human history. People who scattered in terror after their teacher's arrest gathered again. They began to preach, openly in the same Jerusalem, before the same authorities who had just crucified their teacher. To explain this phenomenon, historians have offered different versions. That the disciples saw something and interpreted it as a resurrection. That the teacher's death was experienced by them as a powerful psychological experience, giving rise to visions. That it was a transformation in understanding the death, not an end, but victory through suffering. None of these versions is definitive because the sources show that the first followers of Jesus were completely, sincerely convinced that they had seen him alive. It is this conviction that explains their subsequent willingness to die for their words. People often die for what they believe. They rarely die for what they know they have invented. The movement began to grow rapidly, first in Jerusalem among Jews, then throughout Judea and Samaria, then in the Jewish diaspora, where Jews lived in Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, in the cities of Asia Minor. In the synagogues of the diaspora, the preaching of the risen Messiah found a response among some listeners. And it is here that a person enters the story who would change everything. His Jewish name, Shaul of Tarsus, in Greek, Paul, a native of Tarsus in Asia Minor, a Roman citizen by birth, a Pharisee by education, a connoisseur of Greek culture and Jewish learning. Initially, he was an active opponent of the new movement. By his own admission, he persecuted the Church of God and participated in repressions against the followers of Jesus. His conversion, by his own description, was sudden and stunning. He speaks of a vision of the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. After this event, Paul becomes the main disseminator of the new movement and its main theologian. His contribution was twofold. On the one hand, he placed the death and resurrection of Jesus at the center of theology. The cross, not a shameful end, but a redemptive sacrifice for the sins of all humanity. The resurrection, not just a miracle, but victory over death and a guarantee of the resurrection of all believers. On the other hand, he opened the movement to non-Jews, Gentiles, freeing them from the need to adopt the Jewish way of life, circumcision, dietary laws, the Sabbath. These rules were, according to his theology, a veil removed with the entry into the new covenant. This decision had colossal consequences. It transformed the movement of disciples of a Jewish teacher into a religion addressed to all humanity, regardless of origin, culture, or former life. It was this opening that ensured Christianity its astonishing success in the pagan world. But it was this same decision that deepened the chasm with the Jewish majority. Because for Judaism, the Torah is not a historical stage, not a preparatory step that is passed and left behind. It is the very content of the covenant with God, given to Moses at Sinai and obligatory for the entire people of Israel for all time. To proclaim that the Torah is fulfilled and no longer obligatory meant for most Jews to proclaim a break with the very foundation of Jewish identity. Jews who accepted this message ceased, from the point of view of the others, to be Jews, or at least Jews in the full sense of the word. By the end of the 1st century of our era, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in the year 70, a catastrophe that shook the entire Jewish world and forced Judaism to completely rebuild, the boundary between Judaism and the new movement was finally drawn. Rabbinic Judaism rebuilt itself around the synagogue, the study of the Torah, and the teaching of the rabbis. Christianity increasingly moved into the pagan Greco-Roman world, forming its own communities, rites, and theology. This did not happen instantly or painlessly. For several decades, the Jewish followers of Jesus continued to visit synagogues and participate in Jewish holidays. The rupture was gradual, in places long and painful. But by the end of the 2nd century, these were already two separate worlds, with different texts, different holidays, different communities, and growing mutual alienation. Now, about the deepest source of the division, about how the same sacred texts were read completely differently. The 53rd chapter of the book of the prophet Isaiah is one of the most discussed passages in the history of religious polemics. It speaks of a mysterious servant of the Lord, a being who was wounded for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities, who, like a lamb led to the slaughter, who bore the sin of many. For Christians from the earliest centuries, this is a prophecy about Jesus, written 7 centuries before his coming. The coincidence of details seemed to them impossible to be accidental. Suffering, sacrifice, death, and, in the finale, exaltation. For Jewish interpreters, the picture is different. Already in the context of the book of Isaiah itself, the servant of the Lord appears in several places in clear connection with the people of Israel. You are Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen. In most streams of rabbinic tradition, the servant of the 53rd chapter is a poetic depiction of the fate of Israel itself. a suffering, persecuted, misunderstood people who bear the burden of world history and whose sufferings will one day be understood and acknowledged by other nations. This is not a prediction of someone's biography. It is an image of collective destiny. To speak of which of these readings is the only correct one is to go beyond historical investigation. Both interpretations have deep roots. Both rely on specific linguistic and contextual arguments. Scholars studying this text mostly agree that there is no unambiguous answer, and that it is precisely this ambiguity that has made and makes the text so alive. The 9th chapter of the book of the prophet Daniel is another central polemical text. It speaks of angels and 70 weeks, of a certain anointed one who shall be cut off. Christian interpretation sees here a prophecy about the crucifixion of Jesus with astonishing chronological precision. And this argument dates back to the times of Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. Jewish interpretation relates this text to the events of the Maccabean era, the 2nd century BCE, when Jerusalem was desecrated by King Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The temple was looted and turned into a shrine of Zeus, and the people experienced a severe trial. It is the same text, but it is read in different frames of reference, and the result is fundamentally different. In Christianity, what later came to be called the typological method of interpretation gradually developed. Events and images of the Old Testament are perceived as types, pointing to events of the New. Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, a type of the crucifixion. The Passover lamb, a type of Jesus. The Exodus from Egypt, a type of the salvation of humanity. In this system, the entire Old Testament is read as a preliminary draft of the New. For Judaism, such reading essentially means depriving the Torah of independent content, turning it into a mere stepping stone to something else, which, of course, is completely unacceptable. This was not just a dispute about interpretation. It was a dispute about the very nature of divine revelation. The deepest division lay in the question of the nature of God Himself. At the center of the Jewish religion, from the time of Moses to the present day, stands the Shema, a brief prayer from the book of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. In Hebrew, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. This is not just a declaration of monotheism. It is a confession of the absolute unity of God, a unity that excludes any division, any plurality within Him. This prayer was and is recited by Jews every day, morning and evening. These are the last words a believing Jew strives to utter before death. For this conviction, Jews went to their deaths under Antiochus IV, refusing to worship Greek gods. For this conviction, they refused to honor the emperor in Rome. Christian theology over time developed the doctrine of the Trinity. God is one, but in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This doctrine was formed over several centuries, polemics, councils, theological disputes, and was finally established at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 of our era. According to it, Jesus is not just a man, not just a prophet, and not just the Messiah. He is the Son of God in a special ontological sense, consubstantial with the Father, God from God, light from light. For most Jews, this concept was and remains theologically unacceptable, not because they have not heard it, but because they have heard it and considered it. The idea that God could become incarnate in a man, that a man could be simultaneously fully man and fully God, that within the one God there is some plurality of persons, all this, from the point of view of Jewish theology, contradicts the fundamental principle of monotheism, which Israel preserved at the cost of blood for millennia. No less important was the question of unfulfilled prophecies. The Jewish tradition developed a fairly specific list of what the Messiah must accomplish at his first and only coming. He must restore a sovereign Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel. He must gather the scattered Jews from all corners of the world. He must build or restore the Jerusalem temple. He must establish peace among the nations, such peace that they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, according to the word of the prophet Isaiah. He must lead the whole world to the knowledge of God. None of this happened during Jesus' lifetime. Rome did not go away. The diaspora did not cease. The temple stood, but about 40 years after Jesus' death, it was destroyed. Peace on earth did not come. And this is not nitpicking, not formalism. This is logic flowing directly from the prophetic texts. When his contemporaries asked where the expected signs of the Messiah were, he had no answer for them in their familiar frame of reference. Christianity developed an answer. Jesus will come again, and then all this will be accomplished. The first coming, the suffering Messiah. The second, the triumphant King. This is a theologically coherent concept, but it required a fundamentally new reading of the prophetic texts, one that for most Jews was not and is not obvious. In their frame of reference, the Messiah must fulfill everything promised the first time. The idea of two comings for them is a theological construct invented after the fact to explain the discrepancy. It is here that we should pause and remind ourselves where we are in our investigation. We have examined several layers: the historical expectations of the first century, the activity of Jesus, the reasons for his execution, the first consequences of his death, the theological rupture with Judaism. Now, the most important question that historians call the parting of the ways. How exactly did the final divergence of the two traditions occur, and what remains of this divergence? By the beginning of the 2nd century of our era, the picture looked like this. The majority of Jesus' followers were no longer Jews, but Gentiles, Greeks, Romans, inhabitants of Asia Minor, North Africa, Syria. The Jewish roots of the movement were rapidly receding into the background. Worship shifted from Hebrew and Aramaic to Greek. The Sabbath was replaced by Sunday. Instead of Passover, Christian Easter tied to a different date. Jesus himself in Christian theology was increasingly understood in the categories of Greek philosophy, as the logos, as the word through which the world was created. For Judaism, experiencing its own crisis after the destruction of the temple, this new movement of a Gentile majority was becoming increasingly alien. In some rabbinic texts of the early 2nd century, mentions appear of minim, heretics from whom one must keep away. Historians debate whom exactly these texts meant, followers of Jesus or some other apostates. But the very appearance of such texts indicates that a boundary was being drawn. The Bar Kokhba revolt in the years 132 to 135 of our era became another point of rupture. The leader of the revolt, Simon Bar Kokhba, was proclaimed the Messiah by one of the greatest rabbis of that era, Rabbi Akiva. The followers of Jesus in Judea refused to participate in the revolt under the leadership of a man they did not consider the Messiah. or Jewish nationalists, this was betrayal. The rupture became public and irreversible. Now, about what left the heaviest imprint on this entire history. After Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, this happened gradually, starting with Constantine in the 4th century. The position of Jews in the Christian world began to change. Gradually, then faster and faster. The theological thesis that the Jews rejected the Messiah and bear responsibility for it transformed into social and legal practice. Already in the 4th century, laws appeared restricting the rights of Jews. In the 5th century, prohibitions on building new synagogues, holding public office. In early medieval Europe, Jews were increasingly restricted in the right to own land and forced to live in separate quarters, ghettos. They were depicted in church art and folk legends as villains, poisoners of wells, murderers of children. In the 11th century, the Crusades began. Thousands of armed men moved through Europe to the Holy Land. Along the way, they killed Jews in the Rhineland cities, in Mainz, Worms, Cologne, Speyer. The First Crusade claimed the lives of thousands of Jews in Germany. They were killed in the name of Christ, considering revenge on the God-killers a godly deed. Survivors took refuge in the castles of local bishops, who often protected them. But this did not save everyone. In the 13th to 15th centuries, pogroms in France, England, Germany. In the year 1290, Jews were expelled from England. In 1394, from France. In 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain, a country where they had lived for over 1,000 years and created a brilliant culture, making a colossal contribution to science, poetry, philosophy. The Spanish Inquisition applied torture and execution to those who, after formal baptism, were suspected of secretly preserving Jewish rites. This persecution was called an investigation of blood purity. Marranos, baptized Jews, were persecuted for generations. In Russia and Eastern Europe, waves of pogroms swept through in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In Kishinev in 1903, a pogrom claimed the lives of 45 people. Hundreds were wounded, thousands of families ruined. In Odessa, in Bialystok, in hundreds of other cities, with the silent and often active connivance of the authorities. This generated a huge wave of Jewish emigration to Western Europe, to America, to Palestine, and finally, the Holocaust. The destruction of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s of the 20th century. This crime was not committed in the name of Christianity. Nazi ideology was pagan in its roots, and many Christians became victims of the Nazi regime alongside Jews. But this crime was committed in a country with a 1,000-year Christian culture, with a deeply ingrained image of the Jew as an enemy and alien, which had been formed by church preaching and folk legends for centuries. Why is this important for our topic? Because the history of relations between the Jewish people and Christianity is not just a history of theological polemics. It is a history of real experience, passed down from generation to generation. For a Jew in Poland or Ukraine in the 19th or 20th century, the word cross was not just a symbol of another faith. It was a symbol with which people came to kill, or under which they remained silent while neighbors were killed. And when Christian missionaries or preachers appealed to Jews to accept Jesus, they could not but know what was happening in this context. To accept the faith of those who persecuted your people for centuries, this requires not just theological conviction, but overcoming centuries of collective memory. And this makes the question incomparably more complex than simply, why Jews do not believe the prophecies. The 20th century brought changes, slow, difficult, but real. The Second Vatican Council in 1965 solemnly rejected the accusation of the Jewish people as a whole of deicide. The document Nostra Aetate declared that all humanity bears responsibility for the sins that led to the death of Jesus, and that the Jewish people as a whole cannot be blamed for it. This was a historic turn. The Catholic Church openly renounced the theology that served as the justification for persecution. Pope John Paul II in 1986 became the first pope to visit the Great Synagogue of Rome and called the Jews elder brothers in faith. In 1998, the Vatican published the document We Remember, a reflection on the Holocaust, acknowledging that Christian anti-Semitism created the soil on which the Nazi crime could grow. In the year 2000, John Paul II visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, and placed a note in a crevice of the Western Wall asking forgiveness for the sins of Christians against Jews. These gestures were received differently. For part of Jewish society, they were important but insufficient. For others, it was the beginning of a new dialogue. Protestant churches in various countries adopted similar declarations. In Germany especially, after reflecting on the complicity, albeit passive, of many church institutions in the tragedy of the Holocaust. Today, a broad academic and interreligious dialogue exists between Judaism and Christianity, unthinkable just half a century ago. Jewish scholars study the New Testament as a crucial source for first-century Jewish history. Christian theologians study the Talmud and Midrash to better understand the context of the emergence of their own faith. Joint conferences, academic journals, interreligious meetings, all this has become part of the intellectual landscape. In this dialogue, a new, complex phenomenon has also arisen: Messianic Judaism, a movement of people of Jewish origin who consider Jesus the Messiah, but maintain Jewish identity, observe the Sabbath, celebrate Jewish holidays, and call themselves Jews. For most Jewish religious organizations, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, this is categorically unacceptable. From their point of view, accepting Jesus as the Messiah means leaving Judaism, regardless of whether a person observes the Sabbath. For the Messianic Jews themselves, it is a way to be both Jewish and followers of Jesus simultaneously, without breaking the connection with tradition. This dispute about the very nature of Jewish identity, religious, cultural, ethnic, continues to this day. What remains in the end? What remains is the history of a rupture that occurred not in one moment, but over decades and centuries. A rupture that had several causes: political, theological, historical, human. And a rupture whose consequences proved incomparably more tragic than anyone could have assumed in the first century, when a small group of fishermen and craftsmen gathered in Jerusalem and claimed their teacher had risen. What remains is a theological question that has no historical answer. Who was Jesus in reality? This is a question of faith, not scientific investigation. Historical science can establish that he lived, that he preached, that he was executed. It can study the original context of his activity, reconstruct his words with varying degrees of reliability, describe the process of the formation of the movement of his followers. But the question of his nature, whether he was simply a prophet, a reformer, the Messiah in a human sense, or God incarnate, is a question that science cannot answer. It lies in another dimension. What remains is the question of text interpretation. Why were and are the same words of the prophets Isaiah and Daniel read so differently? This is not a riddle or a mystery. It is the normal nature of how interpretation works. A reader always comes to a text with a certain horizon of expectations, a certain tradition, a certain history. A Jewish reader and a Christian reader come to the prophets from different places and therefore come to different conclusions. This does not mean that one of them is dishonest or blind. It means that texts are richer than any single interpretation, and what remains is the question of memory. A conversation about the Jewish attitude toward Jesus cannot be conducted in isolation from the memory of the Crusades, the Inquisition, pogroms, the Holocaust. This memory is not an abstraction. It lives in specific families, specific communities, specific stories. And it makes every dialogue both necessary and difficult. The history we have examined began in a small province of a vast empire in the 1st century of our era. It gave rise to 2 great religious movements that together encompass half of humanity today: Christianity, with 2 billion followers, and Judaism, with its ancient and living tradition. And it is still not complete, neither theologically, nor historically, nor humanly. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about this history is that it requires not winners and losers, but understanding. Understanding of the depths from which each of these readings grew. Understanding of the price paid for each of these identities. Understanding that serious questions about God, about history, about the meaning of suffering and hope are not resolved in the course of polemics. They remain questions, and in these questions, despite the profound difference in answers, Judaism and Christianity remain connected by common roots in the Torah and the prophets, by common heroes of faith from Abraham to Moses, by a shared memory of one man from Nazareth, around whom debates have not ceased for 2 millennia. The most important debates are those that do not end. To truly understand the depth of this divergence, it is worth pausing on one specific moment: how Passover looked in Jerusalem around the year 30 AD. This moment allows us to see the full complexity of what was happening from within. Passover, Pesach, is one of the most important Jewish holidays. It commemorates the liberation of Israel from Egyptian slavery. During these days, tens of thousands of pilgrims would gather in Jerusalem from all over Judea, Galilee, and the diaspora. The city, which in ordinary times had a population estimated at between 20 and 60,000, would overflow during the holidays. People slept on the streets, outside the city walls, in tents. The atmosphere was both solemn and charged. It was precisely during these Passover days that the events occurred which the Gospels describe as Holy Week. Jesus enters Jerusalem. The people greet him with cries of Hosanna, which roughly means "Save us," and palm branches. This was a symbolic gesture. This is how kings and victors were welcomed. Then, the confrontation in the temple. Then, the Last Supper with his disciples. Then, the arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, the trial before the high priest, the trial before Pilate. Why did Pilate agree to execute him? Roman authority, as a rule, did not interfere in the internal religious disputes of provincials. That anyone whose supporters hailed him as king was politically dangerous. In the year these events took place, Judea was particularly unsettled. Shortly before, several zealots had been executed for attacking Roman soldiers. Pilate was a harsh governor who was later recalled to Rome for excessive cruelty. For him, the execution of a provincial preacher whom the local priest presented as a political threat was a routine administrative decision. The sign nailed to the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, was not a mockery of one man. It was a warning to all who had messianic ambitions or supported such individuals. And here arises the contradiction that proved to be fateful. For the disciples of Jesus, his death was not the end. It became the beginning. But this beginning required a radical rethinking of everything they thought about the Messiah. If he died, how could he be the Messiah? And here emerges the theological answer developed by early Christianity. He did not die by accident or as a defeat. He died as a sacrifice. His death was the very essence of his mission. This reinterpretation of death as victory, sacrifice as salvation, was absolutely untraditional for Jewish theology. In Judaism, a righteous man should not die in place of others. God does not require the death of an innocent to forgive the guilty. The righteous dies for the sins of others. This thesis is not present in Jewish theology. This is precisely why the Apostle Paul, himself raised in this tradition, acknowledged in his first letter to the Corinthians, "We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles." He himself understood perfectly well how alien this demand was to his own roots. The flip side of this theological decision is the interpretation of suffering. The Jewish tradition knows martyrs, people who died for their faith, for observing the Torah, or refusing to worship idols. The Maccabean martyrs killed under Antiochus, Rabbi Akiva executed by the Romans during the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Their death was a tragedy, but also a testimony. However, their death did not save anyone in a theological sense. It was an example, not a redemptive sacrifice. For Christianity, Jesus died for the sins of all people. This is a different frame of reference. Here, death becomes an instrument of salvation. This understanding of sacrifice is closer to certain motifs in Greek culture, to the idea of heroic self-sacrifice, to the concept of tragedy that purifies through suffering, catharsis. Perhaps this is precisely why this theology found such a response in the pagan Greco-Roman world, while for most Jews, it remained alien. Let us now examine one question that often arises in conversations on this topic. Did the leadership of the first-century Jewish communities know what they were doing? Was it a conscious rejection or a sincere misunderstanding? The answer given by history is simple and uncomfortable. The people of that time, the high priests, the Pharisees, ordinary people, acted based on their convictions, their fears, and their understanding of the law. The high priest Caiaphas, who made the decision to arrest Jesus, acted primarily from political logic. It is better to sacrifice one man than to bring Roman repression upon the whole people. This is the logic not of a villain, but of a pragmatist bearing responsibility for the safety of his community. Was it the right choice? From a historical point of view, it can be viewed differently. But it was a human, understandable choice. The Pharisees who opposed Jesus were not hypocrites in a caricatured sense. They were people who dedicated their lives to studying and fulfilling the law. People who kept the Jewish tradition alive under incredibly difficult conditions. Their disputes with Jesus over questions of the Sabbath and ritual purity were part of the normal intra-Jewish discourse of that era. Similar disputes were conducted between various rabbinical schools. The sharpness of the gospel descriptions of these disputes is explained partly by the fact that the Gospels were written after the rupture had occurred, and partly by the polemical genre in which they were written. This is important to understand because for a long time the gospel image of the evil Pharisees served in Christian culture as a stereotype of Jews in general: cunning, hypocritical, legalistic. This stereotype caused enormous harm, fueling anti-Semitism. Modern biblical scholars, both Christian and Jewish, emphasize the Gospels describe a specific historical conflict within first-century Judaism and do not provide a universal characterization of the Jewish people or religious tradition. Let us return to the question of how Judaism developed after the rupture. After the destruction of the temple in the year 70, the rabbis gathered in the city of Yavne began to systematize the oral tradition. The fruit of this work was the Mishnah, a written compilation of rabbinic interpretations of the law, completed around 200 to 210 AD. Then, based on it, the Talmud was compiled. First the Jerusalem Talmud, then the Babylonian Talmud, which became the main authority of rabbinic Judaism. The Babylonian Talmud was completed around the 5th, 6th centuries AD. In this system, Jesus is mentioned only in passing, in a few places, and these mentions are not systematic polemics. Judaism did not build its identity on the denial of Jesus. It built it on the affirmation of the Torah. Jesus occupied far less space in rabbinic literature than it might seem from a Christian perspective. He was one of many preachers of that turbulent era, one of several messianic claimants whose movements were suppressed by Rome or simply faded away on their own. For the rabbis of that time, it was more important how to live by the law in a world without the temple, how to preserve identity in the diaspora, how to pass on the tradition to the next generations. It was precisely this internal focus on the Torah that was the main immunity against the Christian mission. The Jewish tradition did not need completion or fulfillment. It was, and continues to be, a self-sufficient system of meaning, ritual, and identity. Here it is also worth noting how Jewish-Christian relations have changed in recent decades from the perspective of the academic study of Jesus. Starting from the second half of the 20th century, Jewish scholars began to show growing interest in the historical Jesus, precisely as a Jewish teacher, that is, a figure from their own tradition. Researchers such as Shlomo Pines, David Flusser, Geza Vermes, and others have shown that many of Jesus' sayings in the Gospels fit perfectly into the context of first-century Judaism, that his debates with the Pharisees were a form of normal rabbinic polemic, that many of his moral maxims find close parallels in contemporary Jewish texts. This does not mean that Jewish scholars accept Christian theological conclusions. They studied Jesus as a Jew of his time and believe this makes him more understandable, not that it changes his status. But the phenomenon itself, Jewish scholars seriously engaged in the study of the New Testament, would have been unthinkable just a century ago. This is one sign that dialogue is possible. On the other hand, among Christians, a movement has also grown, sometimes called the Jewish roots of Christianity. It insists that the New Testament can only be understood in the context of first-century Judaism, that Jesus himself must be perceived first and foremost as a Jew. This movement sometimes crosses over into Messianic Judaism, which we discussed above, but in a more moderate form, it simply calls for a deeper study of the Jewish context of Christianity. All this indicates that the relationship between the two traditions today is not merely the preservation of mutual grievances and the memory of offenses. It is a complex, living, sometimes tense, but overall increasingly productive interaction between two traditions that emerged from a single source. There is another aspect of this topic that deserves attention: the question of the diversity within Judaism itself and its attitude toward Jesus today. Judaism is not a monolith. Among the 20 million Jews in the world, there are deep differences in levels of religiosity, affiliation with different movements, cultural identity. Among ultra-Orthodox Jews, the question of Jesus simply does not exist as relevant. It is neither interesting nor necessary to them. Among liberal Reform Jews, the attitude can be calmly academic. Jesus is an interesting historical figure, a remarkable Jewish teacher of the first century whose preaching contains wise moral instruction. For secular, non-religious Jews, he is simply a historical figure, evoking neither particular interest nor particular hostility. Hostility, painful reaction, acute unwillingness to hear about Jesus. These are generally not the result of theological conviction. They are the result of historical memory. And this memory is deeply human. Let us return to the main question with which we began. Why did the Jewish people, for the most part, not recognize Jesus as the Messiah?
Not because of blindness, not because of evil intent, not because of some dark motive, but because what he offered did not match what was expected. Because his theological claims and the form formulated by his followers contradicted the very foundation of the Jewish faith. Because the history of the subsequent 2,000 years created a traumatic context that makes acceptance practically impossible. Knowing all this, can we view the Jewish rejection of Christianity as a simple error or blindness? Hardly. It is a consistent theological position, formed on the basis of a 1,000-year tradition, supported by arguments, possessing its own internal logic. Knowing all this, can we view Christianity as a betrayal of Judaism? Also no. It is an independent tradition that grew from Jewish roots, creating its own theological systems, its own culture, its own experience of communion with God. Both traditions bear the imprint of the real historical events of the first century. Both interpret these events in their own way, and both face questions to which the human mind is powerless to give a definitive answer. This is precisely why the history we have examined attracts such attention from historians, theologians, philosophers. It is about the most fundamental human questions, about what we expect from God, about how to read sacred texts, about what it means to be a people, about how memory shapes the present, and about how people arguing about the same thing manage to see completely different things. This story began in the provincial town of Nazareth. It unfolded on the dusty roads of Galilee and in the crowded streets of Passover Jerusalem. It continued in the synagogues of Rome and Antioch, in the monasteries of Egypt, in the rabbinic schools of Babylonia, in the cathedrals of Constantinople, in the ghettos of medieval Europe, in the smoking ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, in the dialogue halls of the Second Vatican Council. And it continues now in every conversation between people of different traditions who ask the same questions and arrive at different answers. In this, perhaps, lies its enduring significance.